Marcus Chen had been working as a maintenance supervisor at Pinnacle International for 3 years when he first encountered the CEO's daughter in the company's executive daycare center. What he witnessed that Tuesday afternoon would challenge everything he thought he knew about privilege, family dynamics, and the lengths people go to protect what matters most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 8-year-old girl sat alone in the corner of the brightly lit playroom, surrounded by expensive toys and educational materials that most children could only dream of. Her designer clothes were pristine, her hair perfectly styled, but her eyes held a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. When the daycare supervisor approached her with a book, speaking in cheerful English, the child simply stared back in silence. When other children tried to include her in their games, she would respond only in rapid Spanish, leaving them confused and eventually causing them to drift away to find more responsive playmates. Marcus noticed her during his routine maintenance checks because she reminded him of his own daughter Emma, who was the same age but lived 3,000 miles away with his ex-wife. The loneliness in the girl's posture struck him immediately. Day after day, he watched her sit in that same corner, building elaborate structures with blocks while speaking softly to herself in Spanish, creating entire conversations and stories that no one else seemed to understand or care about. The daycare staff, all highly credentialed professionals hired specifically to cater to the children of Pinnacle's executives, grew increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as defiance. Marcus overheard their conversations during his work, complaints about how Isabella Rodriguez Hartwell was being difficult, how her refusal to speak English was disrupting the carefully structured environment they'd created for the other children. They spoke about her as if she weren't there, using clinical terms like selective communication disorder and behavioral resistance, completely missing the intelligence that sparked in her dark eyes when she thought no one was watching. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday when Marcus was replacing a broken light fixture near the reading corner. Isabella had been working on an intricate castle made from wooden blocks, carefully constructing towers and bridges with the kind of focus that suggested deep architectural thinking. When one of the daycare workers accidentally knocked it over while reaching for supplies, Isabella's carefully controlled composure finally cracked. She began crying and speaking rapidly in Spanish, her small hands gesturing frantically at the destroyed structure while tears streamed down her cheeks. Marcus found himself setting down his tools and kneeling beside the distraught child, his own limited Spanish from high school suddenly feeling more important than it had in years. He began picking up the blocks, speaking gently in the few Spanish phrases he remembered, asking her to help him understand what she had been building. Isabella looked up at him with surprise, then began explaining in a mixture of Spanish and gestures how the castle had 7 rooms, each one representing a different member of her extended family back in Mexico, people she missed desperately but rarely got to see. As Marcus helped her rebuild the structure, he began to piece together a troubling picture. Isabella wasn't refusing to speak English out of defiance or developmental issues. She was clinging to Spanish as her only connection to a part of herself that was being systematically erased. Her mother, Carmen Rodriguez, had been a successful architect in Guadalajara before marrying CEO William Hartwell in what appeared to be more of a business merger than a love match. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The marriage had required Carmen to relocate to Chicago, learn flawless English, and transform herself into the perfect executive wife, complete with charity board positions and social committee memberships. Isabella had been born into this world of expectations and image management, but her earliest years had been spent with her maternal grandmother, who had filled her childhood with Spanish lullabies, traditional stories, and a deep connection to her cultural heritage. When Isabella turned 5, her father had decided it was time for her to focus entirely on English and American culture, believing this would give her the best advantages in life. Carmen, caught between her husband's demands and her own cultural identity, had reluctantly agreed to stop speaking Spanish at home. The child's refusal to speak English wasn't rebellion, it was survival. In a world where every other aspect of her identity was being carefully molded and controlled, Spanish had become her secret sanctuary, the one thing that remained truly hers. When she spoke her native language, she could still access the warmth and authenticity of her grandmother's stories, the rhythm and music of the culture that lived in her bones even when it was forbidden in her daily life. Marcus understood this instinctively because he recognized the pattern from his own childhood. He had grown up in a household where his Taiwanese grandmother spoke only Mandarin, creating a linguistic divide that had initially seemed like an obstacle, but had ultimately become one of his most treasured gifts. His ability to navigate between languages had given him access to different ways of thinking, different cultural perspectives that had enriched his understanding of the world in ways his monolingual classmates had never experienced. Watching Isabella struggle to preserve her linguistic heritage while living in an environment that viewed it as an inconvenience or impediment, Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. He had seen this before in his own family, the way cultural identity got sacrificed on the altar of assimilation and success, the way children were asked to choose between belonging and authenticity, as if the two were mutually exclusive. The following week brought an unexpected turn of events that would forever change the trajectory of both Marcus and Isabella's lives. William Hartwell had scheduled a major presentation for potential international investors, and the executive daycare had been chosen as a showcase of the company's family-friendly policies. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he watched the staff frantically prepare the space, ensuring every surface gleamed and every toy was arranged with museum-like precision. Isabella seemed to sense the heightened tension in the air. She had withdrawn even further into herself, spending most of her time in the far corner where Marcus had first noticed her, building increasingly complex structures that told stories only she could understand. Her silence had become more pronounced, and even her Spanish whispers had grown quieter, as if she were trying to make herself invisible in anticipation of whatever storm was approaching. The morning of the presentation, Marcus arrived early to complete some final maintenance checks on the air conditioning system. The Chicago summer had been particularly brutal, and the last thing anyone needed was for the climate control to fail during such an important event. As he worked, he noticed Carmen Rodriguez Hartwell enter the daycare center, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with a sound that seemed to echo her nervous energy. Carmen was an elegant woman in her early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested hours of careful preparation each morning. Her English was flawless, but Marcus noticed the way her hands moved when she spoke, gestures that seemed to be searching for words in a different language, expressions that had been trained out of her speech but remained embedded in her body language. She approached Isabella with a mixture of love and desperation that was painful to witness. The conversation between mother and daughter was conducted in hushed English, Carmen's voice carrying the weight of someone trying to convince herself as much as her child. She explained that important people would be visiting today, that Isabella needed to be on her best behavior, that speaking English would make Daddy proud and help Mommy with her social responsibilities. Isabella listened with the solemn attention of a child who had learned that her natural responses were somehow wrong. But when Carmen asked her to promise to speak English, the little girl simply looked down at her hands. Marcus pretended to focus on his work while listening to this exchange, but something about the desperation in Carmen's voice made him pause. This wasn't the demanding tone of a parent insisting on compliance for convenience's sake. This was the pleading voice of someone who was afraid, someone who understood that her daughter's refusal to conform was threatening something much larger than a single presentation. As the morning progressed, executives and investors began arriving for tours of the facility. William Hartwell moved through the space with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having his environment conform to his expectations. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, with the kind of commanding presence that filled rooms and demanded attention. When he spoke about the company's commitment to work-life balance and family values, his words carried the polish of someone who had delivered this speech countless times before. The problems began when one of the investors, an elderly gentleman from Barcelona, noticed Isabella sitting alone and approached her with a warm smile. He spoke to her in Spanish, clearly delighted to encounter a child who might share his native language. Isabella's face lit up for the first time in weeks, and she began chatting animatedly about her block castles, explaining the intricate stories behind each structure with the kind of enthusiasm that had been missing from her interactions for so long. William's reaction was immediate and intense. Marcus watched from across the room as the CEO's face darkened with embarrassment and anger. The presentation was supposed to showcase American excellence and international business acumen, not highlight cultural divisions or language barriers that might suggest inadequate assimilation. The Spanish conversation between Isabella and the investor was drawing attention from other visitors, creating exactly the kind of scene that William had spent years trying to avoid. The confrontation that followed was swift and devastating. William approached his daughter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, placed his hand firmly on her shoulder, and spoke to her in a low voice that carried clear authority. He apologized to the investor in English, explaining that Isabella was going through a phase and was being helped by specialists to overcome her communication challenges. The dismissive way he described his daughter's bilingual abilities as a problem to be solved made Marcus's hands clench around his wrench. Isabella's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She looked up at her father with eyes that held a kind of resignation that no 8-year-old should possess, then quietly returned to her corner and began dismantling the castle she had been so proudly explaining moments before. The joy that had briefly illuminated her face disappeared completely, replaced by the familiar mask of compliance that Marcus had come to recognize as her protective armor. The investor from Barcelona watched this exchange with growing concern, his experienced eyes clearly recognizing the dynamics at play. He made several attempts to continue the conversation with Isabella in Spanish, but she had retreated completely into silence, no longer responding in any language. The man eventually moved on with the tour group, but Marcus noticed him glancing back at Isabella with the kind of worried expression that suggested he understood exactly what he had witnessed. Carmen had watched this entire scene unfold from the doorway, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the pain in her expression. When the tour group moved to another part of the building, she approached Isabella and knelt beside her daughter's destroyed castle. For a moment, Marcus thought she might speak to her child in Spanish, might offer some comfort in the language that clearly brought Isabella such joy. Instead, Carmen began helping to rebuild the structure while speaking in careful English about appropriate behavior and the importance of making good impressions. That afternoon, as Marcus completed his maintenance rounds, he overheard a phone conversation that revealed the true scope of the situation. William was speaking to someone about educational consultants and intensive English immersion programs, discussing options for addressing what he termed Isabella's language fixation before it became a more serious problem. The clinical way he described his daughter's bilingual abilities as a disorder that required intervention made Marcus realize that this wasn't just about social expectations or business presentations. This was about control, about a man who had built his success by managing every variable in his environment and who viewed his daughter's cultural identity as a threat to the carefully constructed image he had spent years developing. Isabella's refusal to abandon Spanish wasn't just inconvenient, it was a reminder that some aspects of human identity couldn't be controlled or commodified, that authentic cultural connection had value that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or investor presentations. The breaking point came later that week when Marcus arrived at work to find Isabella sitting alone in the daycare center, her face streaked with tears, and her usual block castles nowhere to be seen. The daycare supervisor explained that they had implemented a new policy requiring all children to speak only English during structured activities, and that toys would be removed as consequences for non-compliance. Isabella had spent the morning watching her favorite building blocks being locked away in a cabinet, a punishment for the crime of expressing herself in her native language. Marcus found himself making a decision that would change everything. He approached Isabella's corner and, speaking in his rusty but determined Spanish, asked her if she would like to help him with a special project. For the first time in weeks, Isabella looked up with genuine interest, and when Marcus explained that he needed help translating some maintenance manuals that had been provided in Spanish, her entire demeanor transformed. Over the following days, what began as a simple translation exercise evolved into something much more significant. Isabella proved to be remarkably intelligent, easily switching between languages and demonstrating an intuitive understanding of complex concepts that her daycare supervisors had completely overlooked. More importantly, she began to trust Marcus, opening up about her feelings of isolation and her fear that speaking Spanish was somehow wrong or disappointing to her parents. Through these conversations, Marcus learned about Isabella's grandmother, who lived in Guadalajara and spoke to her granddaughter only through brief, supervised video calls. He discovered that Isabella's Spanish wasn't just a language, it was her connection to stories, traditions, and ways of understanding the world that were being systematically eliminated from her daily life. Her refusal to speak English wasn't defiance. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the parts of herself that made her feel whole and connected to something larger than her father's corporate empire. The more Marcus understood about Isabella's situation, the more he recognized parallels to his own struggles as a single father. His daughter Emma lived with his ex-wife in California, and their relationship had been reduced to scheduled phone calls and supervised visits that felt more like business transactions than family connections. He understood what it meant to have your most important relationships mediated by other people's rules and expectations, to have love filtered through systems that prioritized control over authentic connection. This recognition sparked something in Marcus that had been dormant since his divorce, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply getting through each day. Isabella needed someone who understood that preserving her cultural identity wasn't about being difficult or resistant to assimilation. She needed an advocate who recognized that bilingual abilities were gifts, not problems to be solved, and that authentic family connections couldn't be replaced by corporate daycare policies and educational consultants. Marcus's decision to help Isabella preserve her cultural identity came with consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. What started as innocent translation sessions during his maintenance breaks had evolved into something that challenged the very foundations of Pinnacle International's carefully managed environment. Isabella had begun speaking more freely in Spanish during their conversations, her confidence growing with each passing day, but this newfound voice was creating ripples that extended far beyond the daycare center. The first sign of trouble came when the daycare supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, approached Marcus during his lunch break with a concerned expression that barely concealed her frustration. She explained that Isabella had been speaking Spanish to other children, teaching them words and phrases that disrupted the English-only policy they had worked so hard to establish. More troubling from her perspective was that some of the other children were beginning to ask questions about their own family languages, creating what she termed unnecessary complications in the structured learning environment. Marcus listened to these complaints with growing unease, recognizing that his efforts to help Isabella had inadvertently exposed the artificial nature of the restrictions being placed on all the children. The daycare center served families from dozens of countries, and many of the children came from multilingual households, where languages other than English were spoken with fluency and pride. Isabella's renewed confidence in her Spanish had awakened something in these other children, a recognition that they too had been asked to abandon parts of themselves in the name of conformity and administrative convenience. The situation escalated when William Hartwell received a call from Mrs. Patterson expressing concern about his daughter's regression and the influence she was having on other children in the program. Marcus was replacing a broken window latch when he overheard part of this conversation, and the cold anger in William's voice made it clear that someone would be held responsible for what he viewed as a deliberate undermining of his authority and expectations. That afternoon, William arrived at the daycare center unannounced, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the room from relaxed learning to tense performance. Isabella was in the middle of explaining a Spanish counting game to two other children when her father entered, and Marcus watched her entire body language change from animated engagement to fearful compliance. The transformation was instantaneous and heartbreaking, a clear demonstration of how thoroughly she had learned to monitor and modify her behavior based on who was watching. The confrontation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, but Marcus could see the intensity of the exchange between father and daughter. William's questions were sharp and systematic, designed to extract information about who had been encouraging Isabella's Spanish usage and why she thought it was acceptable to disobey the clear guidelines that had been established for her communication. Isabella's responses were barely audible, her earlier confidence completely evaporated under the weight of her father's disapproval. What Marcus witnessed next changed his understanding of the situation entirely. Carmen arrived at the daycare center just as William was finishing his interrogation of Isabella, and the dynamic between husband and wife revealed the true scope of the control being exercised in the Hartwell household. William's questions to Carmen were accusatory and specific, demanding to know whether she had been speaking Spanish at home despite their agreement, whether she had been undermining the English immersion approach they had agreed upon for Isabella's development. Carmen's responses were defensive and desperate, a mixture of denials and explanations that painted a picture of a woman walking on eggshells in her own marriage. She assured William that she had been following their agreement, that any Spanish Isabella might have heard had been accidental or unavoidable during phone calls with her mother in Mexico. The way she apologized for these minimal cultural connections, as if maintaining contact with her own family was a betrayal of her marriage, made Marcus realize that Isabella's language restrictions were part of a much larger pattern of cultural erasure being enforced in their household. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. William demanded to review security footage from the daycare center, searching for evidence of who had been encouraging Isabella's Spanish usage during the times when she should have been focused on English development. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that his conversations with Isabella had likely been captured on the surveillance cameras he maintained as part of his job responsibilities. The confrontation came the following morning when Marcus was called to William's office for what was described as a routine discussion about facility maintenance priorities. The executive suite occupied the entire top floor of the Pinnacle International building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of Chicago's skyline and Lake Michigan beyond. William's office was a carefully curated space that projected power and control, filled with awards, photographs with political figures, and art pieces that suggested both wealth and sophisticated taste. William didn't waste time with pleasantries or indirect approaches. He had reviewed the security footage and identified Marcus as the employee who had been engaging in unauthorized interactions with his daughter during work hours. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in corporate intimidation, with William explaining that employee contracts included specific clauses about appropriate boundaries with executive family members, and that violations of these policies were grounds for immediate termination and potential legal action. Marcus found himself in an impossible position, caught between his genuine concern for Isabella's well-being and the practical reality that he needed his job to support himself and maintain his relationship with his own daughter, Emma. The health insurance and steady income from Pinnacle International were crucial for the custody arrangement he had fought so hard to establish, and losing this position would jeopardize everything he had built since his divorce. But as William continued his methodical dismantling of Marcus's employment security, something shifted in the maintenance supervisor's understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about inappropriate employee behavior or boundary violations. This was about a man who viewed his daughter's cultural identity as a threat to his carefully constructed image, who was willing to destroy the livelihood of anyone who challenged his authority over every aspect of his family's life. The breaking point came when William mentioned that he had been researching boarding schools that specialized in what he termed comprehensive English immersion programs for children from multilingual families. These institutions, he explained, had proven track records of helping children overcome language fixations and develop the communication skills necessary for success in American society. The clinical way he described plans to send Isabella away from her family, to place her in an environment where her Spanish would be completely eliminated, made Marcus understand that this situation was far more serious than he had initially realized. Isabella wasn't just being discouraged from speaking Spanish. She was being systematically prepared for complete cultural erasure. The boarding school William described wasn't an educational opportunity. It was a form of institutional correction designed to eliminate any aspects of identity that didn't align with his vision of appropriate American assimilation. Marcus realized that his small acts of cultural validation had been Isabella's last connection to the parts of herself that William was determined to destroy. The choice Marcus faced was stark and immediate. He could apologize, accept whatever disciplinary action William deemed appropriate, and return to his maintenance duties with the understanding that Isabella would be sent away to have her cultural identity professionally eliminated. Or he could take a stand that would almost certainly cost him his job, his health insurance, and his carefully maintained stability, but might give Isabella a chance to preserve the parts of herself that made her whole. As William waited for his response, Marcus thought about his own daughter, Emma, and the conversations they had about identity, belonging, and the courage required to stand up for what was right. He thought about Isabella's face when she spoke Spanish, the joy and confidence that emerged when she was allowed to express herself authentically. Most importantly, he thought about the kind of person he wanted to be when faced with a choice between personal security and moral responsibility. The words that came out of Marcus's mouth surprised even him. Instead of the apology or explanation that William was clearly expecting, Marcus began speaking in Spanish, slowly and deliberately, explaining that Isabella's bilingual abilities were gifts that should be celebrated rather than problems to be solved. He told William that cultural identity wasn't something that could or should be eliminated, that forcing a child to abandon her heritage was a form of damage that would affect her for the rest of her life. William's reaction was immediate and predictable. Security was called, Employment was terminated, and Marcus found himself escorted from the building with a box of personal belongings and a warning about the legal consequences of any further contact with the Hartwell family. But as he walked through the daycare center for the last time, Isabella looked up from her corner and smiled at him with an expression of recognition and gratitude that made every consequence worthwhile. The weeks that followed were among the most challenging of Marcus's adult life. Without steady employment, he struggled to maintain his apartment and worried constantly about how the job loss would affect his custody arrangement with Emma. He applied for dozens of positions, but William Hartwell's influence in Chicago's business community was extensive, and Marcus discovered that finding equivalent employment would be far more difficult than he had anticipated. But something had changed in Marcus during that confrontation in William's office. A recognition of his own capacity for moral courage that had been dormant since his divorce. He began researching Isabella's situation more systematically, learning about the legal rights of children to maintain cultural connections, and the psychological damage caused by forced assimilation programs. What he discovered convinced him that Isabella's situation was not just unfortunate, it was potentially illegal, a form of cultural abuse that violated both state regulations and international conventions on children's rights. 3 months after losing his job at Pinnacle International, Marcus found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a child psychologist specializing in multicultural identity development, had been contacted by Carmen Rodriguez Hartwell through a referral from her family physician. Carmen had finally reached the point where her concern for Isabella's emotional well-being outweighed her fear of her husband's reaction, and she was seeking professional guidance about her daughter's increasing withdrawal and anxiety. Dr. Vasquez had been practicing in Chicago for over 15 years, working primarily with immigrant families and children struggling with identity conflicts in predominantly English-speaking environments. She had seen countless cases of cultural suppression and understood the long-term psychological damage that occurred when children were forced to abandon their heritage languages and traditions. When Carmen described Isabella's situation during their initial consultation, Dr. Vasquez immediately recognized the signs of what she termed linguistic trauma, the deep emotional wounds caused by systematic invalidation of a child's native language and cultural identity. The consultation had been arranged secretly, without William's knowledge, during one of his frequent business trips to the East Coast. Carmen had driven to Dr. Vasquez's office in a state of barely controlled panic, knowing that if her husband discovered she was seeking professional help without his approval, the consequences would extend far beyond simple marital conflict. She described Isabella's recent behavior changes with the detailed precision of someone who had been observing every nuance of her daughter's emotional state for months. Isabella had stopped eating her favorite foods, claiming they tasted wrong or made her feel sick. She had begun having nightmares that left her crying and speaking rapidly in Spanish, dreams she couldn't or wouldn't describe in English when her parents asked for explanations. Most troubling, she had started pulling out her own hair, small sections that she hid by carefully arranging the remaining strands, a self-soothing behavior that indicated severe psychological distress. Dr. Vasquez listened to Carmen's description with growing concern, recognizing patterns she had seen in other children who had been subjected to aggressive cultural assimilation pressures. She explained that Isabella's behaviors were not signs of defiance or developmental problems, but rather normal responses to an abnormal situation. When children were forced to suppress fundamental aspects of their identity, their psychological systems often manifested distress through physical symptoms, sleep disturbances, and self-harm behaviors. The breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez asked Carmen to describe a typical day in Isabella's life, paying particular attention to any moments when the child seemed relaxed or genuinely happy. Carmen's response revealed the profound isolation Isabella was experiencing in her own home. The only time she appeared truly at ease were during brief phone calls with her grandmother in Mexico, conversations that were carefully monitored and limited to 10 minutes per week, and during the few occasions when she had been allowed to interact with Marcus Chen, the maintenance supervisor who had been fired for encouraging her Spanish usage. Dr. Vasquez made a decision that would dramatically alter the trajectory of Isabella's situation. She asked Carmen to provide Marcus's contact information, explaining that in cases of cultural suppression, it was often crucial to reconnect children with adults who validated their complete identity rather than demanding they fragment themselves to meet others' expectations. Carmen was initially reluctant, knowing that any contact with Marcus would represent a direct violation of William's explicit instructions. But her desperation for Isabella's well-being ultimately overcame her fear of her husband's reaction. Marcus was working a temporary construction job on the south side when he received Dr. Vasquez's call. The work was physically demanding and paid significantly less than his position at Pinnacle International, but it kept him occupied during the long days when he wasn't able to talk with his own daughter, Emma. The psychological toll of unemployment had been harder than the financial struggles, leaving him with too much time to second-guess his decision to stand up to William Hartwell and wonder whether his moral stance had been worth the personal cost. Dr. Vasquez's explanation of Isabella's deteriorating condition hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had known that his termination would eliminate Isabella's one source of cultural validation at Pinnacle International, but he hadn't fully understood the extent to which his presence had been serving as a psychological lifeline for the isolated child. Learning that Isabella was now exhibiting signs of serious emotional distress, including self-harm behaviors, made Marcus realize that the situation had moved far beyond workplace politics or employment disputes. The meeting between Marcus, Dr. Vasquez, and Carmen took place at the psychologist's office on a Saturday morning when William was attending a corporate retreat in Wisconsin. Carmen arrived looking exhausted and frightened, her usual polished appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. She had brought Isabella, who sat quietly in the waiting room with a children's book written in Spanish that she held but didn't read, her small fingers constantly moving through her hair in the self-soothing gesture that had become her primary coping mechanism. Dr. Vasquez began the session by explaining her assessment of Isabella's psychological state, using clinical terms that somehow made the situation feel both more serious and more manageable. She described how forced cultural assimilation created what she called identity fragmentation, a condition where children learn to suppress essential parts of themselves to avoid punishment or disappointment. Over time, this fragmentation led to anxiety, depression, and a profound sense of disconnection from their own emotions and experiences. The solution Dr. Vasquez proposed was both simple and revolutionary. Isabella needed regular contact with adults who celebrated, rather than merely tolerated, her bilingual abilities. She needed opportunities to express herself in Spanish without fear of consequences or correction. Most importantly, she needed to understand that her cultural heritage was not something shameful to be hidden, but rather a source of strength and richness that enhanced rather than diminished her American identity. Marcus found himself agreeing to become what Dr. Vasquez termed a cultural mentor to Isabella, meeting with her twice weekly in supervised sessions designed to rebuild her confidence in her Spanish abilities and help her develop strategies for maintaining her cultural identity while navigating the predominantly English-speaking environments she encountered daily. These sessions would take place at Dr. Vasquez's office, providing a neutral space where Isabella could safely explore the parts of herself that had been systematically suppressed. The first mentoring session was tentative and carefully structured, with Dr. Vasquez present to facilitate communication and ensure that appropriate boundaries were maintained. Isabella entered the office quietly, her behavior demonstrating the hypervigilance that had become her default mode of interacting with adults. She sat rigidly in her chair, hands folded in her lap, waiting for instructions about what was expected of her and how she should perform to meet the adults' requirements. Marcus began the session by speaking to Isabella in Spanish, asking simple questions about her interests and favorite activities. Her initial responses were monosyllabic and cautious, but gradually she began to relax, as she realized that her Spanish words were being received with genuine interest rather than correction or redirection. When Marcus asked her to tell him about her grandmother in Mexico, Isabella's entire demeanor shifted, her posture straightening, and her voice becoming animated, as she described the stories her abuela told during their brief phone conversations. The transformation was remarkable and immediate. Within 30 minutes, Isabella had evolved from a withdrawn, anxious child to an engaged, articulate young person who demonstrated remarkable intelligence and creativity when allowed to express herself authentically. She told elaborate stories in a mixture of Spanish and English, switching between languages with the fluid competence that indicated true bilingual ability rather than confusion or deficiency. Dr. Vasquez observed this transformation with professional satisfaction, taking detailed notes about Isabella's language patterns, emotional responses, and comfort levels. She explained to Marcus that what they were witnessing was Isabella's authentic personality, emerging from beneath the layers of suppression and anxiety that had been accumulating over months of cultural invalidation. This was who Isabella really was, when she wasn't expending enormous emotional energy monitoring and modifying her behavior to meet others' expectations. The sessions continued twice weekly for 6 weeks, each one revealing new aspects of Isabella's personality and intelligence that had been hidden by her fear of expressing herself inappropriately. She demonstrated remarkable artistic ability, creating intricate drawings that told stories spanning both Mexican and American cultural traditions. Her mathematical skills were far more advanced than the daycare assessments had indicated, particularly when problems were presented in Spanish or related to concepts from Mexican culture. Most importantly, Isabella began developing what Dr. Vasquez called code-switching competence, the ability to move fluidly between different cultural and linguistic contexts without losing her core sense of identity. She learned strategies for maintaining her Spanish abilities while functioning effectively in English-dominant environments, understanding that true bilingual competence required mastery of both languages rather than abandonment of one in favor of the other. Carmen attended several of these sessions, initially as an observer but gradually becoming more active as she watched her daughter's confidence return. The sessions provided Carmen with her first opportunity in months to interact with Isabella in Spanish without fear of her husband's disapproval, and she began to recognize how much of her own cultural identity she had sacrificed in her attempts to create what William considered an appropriate American family environment. The turning point came during the 8th session when Isabella asked Marcus why her father thought speaking Spanish was wrong and whether loving her grandmother in Mexico meant she was being disloyal to her American family. The question revealed the profound confusion that had been tormenting Isabella for months. Her 8-year-old mind had been trying to make sense of messages that positioned her cultural heritage and her family loyalty as mutually exclusive choices. Marcus's response was carefully considered, and Dr. Vasquez approved. He explained that speaking multiple languages was a gift that made people smarter and more capable, not a problem that needed to be fixed. He told Isabella that loving her grandmother and honoring her Mexican heritage actually made her a better American, because the United States was built by people from many different cultures who brought their traditions and languages as contributions to the country's strength and diversity. This conversation marked the beginning of Isabella's psychological recovery, but it also intensified the conflict that had been building in Carmen's marriage to William. The positive changes in Isabella's behavior were impossible to hide, and William began demanding explanations for his daughter's renewed confidence and occasional use of Spanish words during their family interactions. The confrontation William had been building toward finally erupted on a Thursday evening when he returned home early from a business dinner to find Carmen and Isabella speaking Spanish while preparing traditional Mexican hot chocolate in their kitchen. His reaction was swift and decisive, demanding immediate explanations and threatening to implement the boarding school solution he had been researching for months. But something had fundamentally changed in both Carmen and Isabella during their weeks of sessions with Dr. Vasquez and Marcus. Carmen no longer cowered under William's anger, instead standing protectively beside her daughter and speaking calmly about Isabella's right to maintain connections with her cultural heritage. Isabella, rather than retreating into fearful silence, looked directly at her father and explained in clear English why speaking Spanish made her feel complete and connected to important parts of her family. William's response revealed the depth of his need for control. He contacted his lawyers immediately, initiating proceedings to gain full custody of Isabella and have Carmen declared an unfit mother due to her failure to follow their agreed-upon parenting approach. He also filed complaints against Dr. Vasquez with the state licensing board and threatened legal action against Marcus for what he termed unauthorized contact with his minor child. The legal battle that followed became a landmark case in Illinois family court, drawing attention from children's rights advocates and multicultural education specialists across the country. Dr. Vasquez's detailed documentation of Isabella's psychological improvement during the cultural mentoring sessions provided compelling evidence that William's approach had been causing measurable harm to his daughter's emotional development. Marcus found himself testifying about the transformation he had witnessed in Isabella when she was allowed to express herself authentically. His simple, honest descriptions of a child's joy in sharing her grandmother's stories resonated powerfully with the judge, who had herself grown up in a bilingual household and understood the psychological violence of forced cultural erasure. The turning point came when Isabella was interviewed by the court-appointed child advocate. Speaking confidently in both English and Spanish, she explained that she loved both parts of her heritage and didn't understand why she had to choose between them. Her articulate, mature responses demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated thinking that bilingual education was designed to develop. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and groundbreaking. Isabella would remain with Carmen, who was granted primary custody with the requirement that she maintain Isabella's bilingual education and cultural connections. William was ordered to attend counseling sessions focused on understanding the psychological benefits of multicultural identity development. Most significantly, the court established precedent recognizing children's rights to maintain their heritage languages and cultural practices regardless of parental preferences. 6 months later, Marcus had established Chicago Cultural Bridges, a non-profit organization providing mentorship and advocacy for multilingual children facing family or institutional pressure to abandon their heritage languages. Isabella became one of his first success stories, thriving in a new bilingual school where her Spanish abilities were celebrated as academic advantages rather than problems to be solved. Carmen enrolled in graduate courses in multicultural education, channeling her own experience into advocacy work that helped other immigrant families navigate the complex balance between assimilation and cultural preservation. She and Marcus developed a professional partnership that grew into something deeper, built on shared commitment to protecting children's right to authentic self-expression. William eventually completed his court-mandated counseling and began rebuilding his relationship with Isabella, slowly learning to appreciate the remarkable young woman his daughter was becoming when allowed to embrace all aspects of her identity. Their relationship remained complicated, but it was no longer defined by his need to control every aspect of her cultural expression. Isabella flourished in her new environment, becoming a confident advocate for other bilingual children and eventually serving as a peer mentor in Marcus's program. Her story became a powerful example of how children could maintain strong connections to multiple cultures while succeeding in American society, proving that authentic identity was a source of strength rather than an obstacle to overcome. Years later, when Isabella graduated as valedictorian from her high school with acceptance letters to prestigious universities, she delivered her speech in both English and Spanish, honoring both sides of her heritage while looking forward to a future where her multicultural identity would be an asset in an increasingly connected world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.